Hi guys, I'm Jeremy and I'm coming to you from Denver, Colorado. Just northwest of here, about 50 miles as the crow flies, is Long's Peak, which is the highest peak in Rocky Mountain National Park. Because this peak's so popular and dangerous, it actually has the most fatalities of any other peak in Colorado. In the last 100 years, there's been almost 75 fatalities. So definitely not the safest place to go hiking if you're an amateur. So 2 weeks ago on May 12th, Space Force Sergeant Lucas Macaj, who was just 23, made it to the summit of Long's Peak. He had texted his friend, and he must have gone down a different route and fell, and unfortunately lost his life. And in the last couple years, he's not the only one that's lost his life. There's been a few others, but I'd like to focus on two other ones to try to learn from these cases. Another young guy from Colorado named Russell Jacobs, who had some experience hiking, he went up there on September 16th, 2022, just after his 25th birthday, and he got hit with a bad storm, got disorientated, and I assume died of hypothermia. So a really tragic case there. And then another story is of Chad Pallansch. Apologies if I pronounce that wrong. He's an ultra runner who had actually been up to Long's Peak more than 30 times. So definitely a guy with some experience. So he was out trying a new route from Grand Lake over towards Mount Alice and back. It's about 28 miles. And that place is really dangerous because it's really far from anything, right in the middle of the park. And he went out on September 27th and he never made it back. And there was a big search party for a couple weeks and they suspended that before winter came. I imagine there's going to be another search party, but obviously at this point we know it's obviously not going to be a good outcome. So anyway, first of all, my heart goes out to all the families and loved ones and friends. Obviously horrible situation. Of course, it's important to grieve and for people to go out and try to search for these people, but it's also important to try to learn from this. And so in this video, I'm going to try to give you at least a dozen tips and some advice if you're coming out to Colorado or just hiking high mountains in general. If you go anywhere else in the world, all of these same things apply. And it doesn't even have to be 14,000 foot peaks that are dangerous. Even if you go on the Appalachian Trail, there's dangerous areas. Every year people die of exposure on places like Mount Washington.
So I'll first go into the weather, climate, and precipitation in Colorado. It's super different in Denver compared to the mountains. So Denver's a mile high at 5,280 feet. So in Colorado, you actually have 58 peaks that are over 14,000 feet. So it's a really popular area for a lot of people, not just in Colorado, but from many places all over the states to come and try to do many of these peaks. And a lot of people don't have a ton of experience, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this video. So the area around Denver and eastern Colorado only gets 10 to 15 inches of rain. Some areas are even less. And you have to consider that a desert is actually less than 10 inches, so it's super dry out in this area. Now in the mountains of Colorado, you can get up to 50 inches of precipitation, which in the form of snow can be hundreds of inches. So it's really a big difference in Denver compared to the mountains. So Denver gets about 300 days of sunshine. So even in winter, you could go a couple weeks without snow. And you might think the mountains nearby, like an hour away, are the same, but they could get, several feet of snow. And when it snows in Denver and in the Front Range, meaning all the mountains nearby that are like 6, 7, 8,000 feet, it usually melts within, a day or two in Denver or a few days up in those areas. So it's not like you see snow around all the time because the sun's so strong and the temperature is a little warmer than the high mountains. Now, if you go up over 9,000 feet and above, there could be snow there all winter, even into June or July. So as you can imagine, the wind at higher elevations is much stronger. So even if it's not windy in Denver, at high altitudes you could get 30, 40, 50, 100 mile per hour winds up there. So it's completely different. And it could get even windier when you're getting above tree line, which is generally about 12,000 feet. There's no trees to block the wind, and it could be insane up there. And of course, wind chill is a big factor. Even if it's 30 degrees and doesn't feel really cold, if you have 50-mile-per-hour winds, it could be like negative 20 wind chill. So also the temperature is much colder at higher elevations. For every 1,000 feet you go up, it's about 3.5 degrees colder. So in Denver, it's 5,280 feet. So if you're going to go up to 14,280 feet, so that's almost 32 degrees colder. So if it's 62 in Denver and pretty nice, it might be just 30 degrees at, like around 14,000 feet. And of course, it could be much lower than that too, especially with wind chill. Like I saw the weather today was in the 50s, and it's only about 15 degrees on Long's Peak today with 25-mile-per-hour winds. So as far as looking at the forecast, you can't look at Denver or like Estes Park, which is next to Rocky Mountain Park, or Boulder, or any towns. You need to actually know what the peak is that you're going to do. I like this site, Mountain Forecast here. This has the temperature, wind, precipitation, not only at the top, but like every 1,000 feet or so. And so that could be super helpful for you. So all three of these gentlemen unfortunately passed away in transition seasons. Basically like the beginning of fall or the beginning of summer. Basically what I'm talking about is like around September, October, it could be dangerous because that's when snow comes. And the end of spring/winter could be like April and May. And so this doesn't surprise me because these times of year is very deceiving. What I mean by this is like in, January, February, March, you have a winter mentality. It's super cold, everyone's out skiing. You know that all of the mountains are just full of snow. But by like mid-May or even the end of April, Denver, just like many places in the U.S., could get pretty hot. Normally it's just the 70s, but you could get up to the 80s or so, and the vegetation comes in and the flowers are blooming, everything's becoming green. People are wearing shorts and t-shirts, and it's starting to feel like summer, but just an hour away at a peak, it could be just 15 degrees with wind chills. So it's normal that people head out to these places and aren't dressed appropriately, especially in times like May or like September or October. During this time of year, you still have a lot of snow, over 12,000, 13,000 feet and up, into late June and even July in some years. And even into August, there's patches of snow all around. Here's some footage here of a trip I did on May 30th last year to some 13,000 foot peaks. And you can see there's a few patches where it's dry, but about 90% is still snow. Some of that's deep, some of it isn't. But there's definitely a lot of snow up there, and you definitely need micro spikes and sometimes snowshoes. And so what happens is also like in September and October, it's hot in Denver, you go up there, but then you get a big surprise that a huge winter storm could come in or cold rain. And if it gets super windy and you're not dressed appropriately, it only takes 30 minutes to start getting hypothermia and you're finished, So you got to be dressed appropriately. Winter snow in many ways is actually safer because you already have good clothes on and you could just brush off snow. But if you have shorts and a t-shirt on, or you get hit with cold rain and wind, it's just really dangerous. It's just a recipe for disaster. And of course, you can imagine storms can move in really fast at high elevations. You could be, in the sun, relaxing, having a meal, and, it feels pretty warm. And within 20 minutes, you could get a lightning storm, or you could get hit with a snowstorm or something like that. And also another thing to consider is that in the summer, you get afternoon lightning storms. And so if you're above tree line and you start to get hit with a lightning storm, there's a chance you get hit by lightning and killed too. And it happens. So you got to really start early, like 5 in the morning or 6 at least, to make sure you're getting down by about noon. So let's move on from weather and climate. So, how do you think most people get injured or die climbing? So, many people might assume like they might actually fall or something going up, but the majority of people actually die on their way down for a few reasons. When you're going up, it's tough because, of course, you're going against gravity. But when you're going down, it takes a lot of effort not to have the gravity push you down too hard because, of course, you could slip and fall. And now, if it's just, falling a few feet, it's not a big deal. But if there's a cliff, that could obviously mean your death. The other big thing is altitude sickness. Especially if you're going out to like really high peaks, like in the Himalayas or something. I mean, you could go up and get really bad altitude sickness and die. In Colorado, that could happen too, but you're more than likely just to get like regular altitude sickness, which still sucks. I mean, to describe it, it basically feels like a hangover. You don't want to eat, you've got a headache, you might feel like you're going to throw up, or you do start throwing up. I've been on some trips in Colorado with people who are coming from Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and flat areas. They think they could conquer the world. They come out, and try to do these 12, 13, 14,000 foot peaks, and they get really sick. So you got to acclimatize. You got to stay in Denver for a day or two, maybe do one of the, lower peaks, maybe around Boulder or Denver that's like, 8,000, 9,000 feet, and then maybe go up to like a 12 or 13,000 foot peak, and then do a 14,000 foot peak. If you come out here and go straight to 14,000 feet, you're probably going to not make it because you're probably going to get sick. Now, not everyone, but a lot of people. I mean, I would say probably a third of the people would get sick doing that. So the other problem about getting to the peak is that you have this feeling of accomplishment like the trip's over. You made it. But the reality is that you're only halfway there. There's still a good chance, you could get hurt or even die, on the way down, especially in really dangerous areas, especially if there's a lot of snow and ice. This is exactly what happened with Lucas. He had texted someone from the top and fell on the way down. Chad, I think, was near the peak, and I wouldn't be surprised if he made it to the top, and it was probably on the way down. And with Russell, I don't think he made it to the peak, but he's on his way down trying to get out there in time, and unfortunately didn't make it. So another really important thing to know about hiking in Colorado is that there's no markers on the trees or anything to know like what direction you're going or which way the trail is going. So like when I hiked on the Appalachian Trail or many places, they have white blazes or white markers on the trees so you know what direction to go in. So that's definitely not the case here for the most part. Now, in the summer, it's not too bad because it's kind of obvious where a trail is. Or even if there's some snow and you're like on a big wide trail that maybe people like drive Jeeps on or four-wheelers, it might be kind of obvious. But a lot of trails get really narrow and you're not going to be able to know where to go if it's all covered in snow. And you're not going to be able to retrace your steps if you're in the middle of a blizzard and the snow covered everything. So you need to have those maps downloaded if you haven't done that before you left, and make sure you got plenty of battery left on your phone. If you're even kind of getting low and you're not sure about what's going on, you need to head out immediately because it's really easy to get lost. So in the summer, most of us want to get away from the crowds, and so we go to a more obscure area or hike, but it's kind of like the opposite is true in winter. Because if you go to obscure areas in winter, like I did last year a bunch of times, there's no one who already laid the tracks for you. So you have to do that on your own. And not only is it harder, you have no idea where to go after a while, and the snow can get up to your waist. So I usually go to more popular areas where I can look on like All Trails or something and see who's been there that week. If you go to an obscure area, you're going to have to figure out the whole route. Which is possible. I mean, I've done it. But you're just going to randomly walk through the woods, and sometimes when you step down, it could be on a 3-foot log or a huge boulder or a huge hole. You don't know what's below your feet, below that snow, so that's dangerous as well. And then when you're above tree line, there's no markers anyway because there's no trees to put a mark, even if they had that. So sometimes they have cairns. Not the Karens like the obnoxious women calling the police on people, but these big rock piles that they put along the way so people know where they're going. But some of those you can't see in winter either, so you definitely need to have your maps downloaded and be able to check your GPS when you're doing this. So one last thing I'll mention until I go into these unfortunate stories of these guys is having the right mindset when you're out there. So I remember when I was hiking the Appalachian Trail just over 20 years ago now, I was a northbounder and I was at a shelter and I took off. And, after an hour or two, I ran into one of the guys I knew. His trail name was Papa Smurf, and I was Pig Chicken at that time. And anyway, he's like, which way you going? I'm like, I'm going to this shelter. He's like, you're going the wrong way. I was like, what? And so, when I was at that shelter, I smoked a bowl and was all spaced out and baked. And, I know a lot of us when we get out here on these trips, whether you get to the peak or you're hiking, whatever, you want to smoke pot. And that's okay, but guess what? If you're in a situation where a huge storm rolls in, you're already going to be disorientated and panicking and making bad decisions. And so I don't know about everyone else, but I think the majority of people, when you're drunk or when you're stoned, you do not have a good sense of direction. And when there's a life or death situation, you don't need to be completely spaced out in another world, because this could be the matter of life or death. So I'm not saying never smoke pot when you're, out in the outdoors, like when you get to your campsite or you're camping or something, that's fine. Or you're doing some very leisurely hike. But if you're going to come up and do some of these pretty intense peaks, like Long's Peak, which is a class 3, you definitely need to have your wits about you. So let's get into the tragic cases here of Russell, Lucas, and Chad. So with Russell Jacobs, it's pretty straightforward. He just got really unlucky. He went up there in mid-September, which, as I mentioned, in Denver, it could be 95 degrees. And there was a strange winter storm that moved in, which was early for that season. And he probably had summer or light clothes on and needed something, more like winter gear. And then he got, disorientated as the storm moved in, probably panicked a bit. The sad part is that he was actually in contact a bit with his friends and even the rescue teams, but they couldn't get out there until the next day. And so there's just no way you could stay a night out there, without a tent and sleeping bag or at least like an emergency blanket or something. And unfortunately, hypothermia overtook him. So hypothermia and falls are actually two of the biggest ways people lose their lives mountaineering. And of course, also, there's a lot of people that get killed in avalanches. I won't really go too much into that. There is a good website you can look at for Colorado called the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. That'll show you on the map which areas of Colorado from 1 to 5 are the most dangerous. So right now it's almost the end of May, so everything's pretty low, but in the winter it could get up to very high or extreme. So just totally avoid those areas. And if you're going to do any 14ers in the winter, maybe Beardstadt or Quandary, but not too many others unless you've got a lot of experience with snow mountaineering and stuff. And of course, dehydration's big too. So you want to make sure you've got plenty of water because, most of these areas, you might find water at the beginning of the hike, but as you get higher, there's definitely no water. So you got to be careful of that too. So make sure you've got an emergency blanket. If you can, bring a really light tent and a sleeping bag. I know that'll slow you down a bit, and that extra weight could actually be kind of bad on your feet with your footing in some cases. So make your own judgment on that, but it could be the matter of life or death, whether you have small bivvy and a little sleeping bag. At least you could get through the night in some of these cases if this kind of thing happens. And also make sure you always have micro spikes, almost all year here in Colorado, because there's definitely going to be some snow in certain areas. And if you have to get down a steep area where there's a lot of snow, you're going to need that. And, they're super light and they're cheap, so I would always have micro spikes. And then with snowshoes, you need them obviously throughout winter, especially if you're on a trail that's not well worn. And then in those odd seasons, like in May or September, you might need them. It just kind of depends where you're going. So with Lucas, it's a bit different and super tragic too. I think he made a common mistake any one of us could have made. He had already summited and I'm sure was excited and ready to get back to his car. And he thought, like a lot of us, let's try a different route. Why not? You know, you could maybe go a different route and shave off a couple of miles. And so from the summit, he should have gone to the northwest and then went back northeast towards his car. Where he started, as the crow flies, is northeast. So if you just, went straight that way, you could maybe get back a little faster. But of course, from that angle from the top, he probably knew it was super steep and maybe cliffs there, so he could try to go southeast first. And then you could go down this area called the Lamb Chute, which at least looks safe from far away. Now, to me, I think you would need ropes to do that, but it's the safest way compared to all the other rocks around there. And so now, when you hike up a mountain, there's something called a false summit. Basically what happens is, you're looking at the mountain in front of you, but you can't see the mountain behind that. So it kind of gives you a false idea of what's actually there. The same is true in the opposite direction. So in other words, you might look down to the southeast and see the mountain kind of going down, and then you could go down that Lamb Chute. It doesn't look too bad. You might see a little bit of a dip there, but it might actually look relatively smooth. And when you go down after, 10, 15 minutes, you'll definitely see there's this big notch there. And maybe he thought, well, I don't want to go back up, hike up 20 minutes to the peak again, or whatever time it would take, and go back down that other way. I could try to get around this and get down to that Lamb Chute. And as you can imagine there, I bet there's a good amount of snow and ice. I mean, if he slipped in any direction, especially to the left, you would fall 1,000 feet. And if he even got around that, which doesn't look easy to me, and he got to the Lamb Chute, there's some sections there that are really sketchy. That might be the kind of thing where maybe if you're going uphill, as I mentioned, it might be safer in the way that, you're less likely to slip. But when you're going downhill, you're moving down and gravity's pushing with you. If you start to slip and fall, you're going all the way down to the bottom. Which is why I see, at least in pictures, people have ropes for that. Because that's not safe to do without like some ropes or someone else tied to you or whatever. So I'm imagining he fell on that notch or somewhere near that Lamb Chute. And this kind of situation happens a lot of the time, especially places like Capitol Peak, which is one of the more infamous, notorious peaks in Colorado that's quite dangerous. You have this knife's edge section before you get to the top that looks super sketchy. And a few years ago in 2017, a young couple named Carlin Brightwell and Ryan Marcil went up there. They got to the peak, and we're not sure what happened, but they're coming back, and it looks like maybe they wanted to go around the knife's edge or a different way back. And I imagine they lost some of their footing, and the rocks below them fell out because it's so steep, and they both fell to their death. So super tragic, but it's just a reminder that you have to go back the same way. Unless you've studied the maps very well and you're very well aware of the possibility of other routes, there's a reason why people made these routes to these peaks. They're going to be the safest route, generally speaking. And there could be many other ways up to these peaks, but they're generally going to be more dangerous. So let's talk about Chad Pallansch's story. He was coming from the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. So this is west of Longs Peak. He left from the East Inland Trailhead, just east of Grand Lake, and he was going to do a big loop and come back pretty close by where he started to the North Inlet Trailhead. So it's about a 28-mile loop, and a good amount of that is on all trails, and I think some other maps. I see, there's definitely some trails through there, But near Mount Alice, there's not really a lot of established routes. That area is really remote. It's in the middle of the park, and it's far away from everything. Like, there's no roads going close to there. You know, you've got to hike 15, 20 miles to get kind of in that area. So it's not super well traveled. And so, as I mentioned, there's not going to be an easy route to figure out above tree line because there's no big trail markings except for some cairns or whatever. And this is also a big problem for a rescue team because, you know, if you're on like an established trail, of course, like the first place to find people, you're going to start off on the main trail and then branch out. Well, if you're on an unmarked trail in the middle of just a huge big region, they don't know exactly where to go. So I'm imagining, I know he sent a text near the top of Mount Alice. So I'm not sure if he got hurt there or something happened there, or as I said, most likely it's on your way down. So he got to the peak, was coming down somewhere. I don't know if he had a big fall and perished, or he might have just got like, you know, a broken ankle, slipped, he fell, he's got a broken leg or ankle, and then you have to crawl. And obviously you can't crawl more than like a mile in a day or something. And that area around Mount Alice isn't just remote. I mean, it's pretty dangerous up there. That's another class 3 like Long's Peak. So if he's out there alone and something happens, the rescue teams, you know, were probably out, I assume the next day, so he would have been out there all night. And this is in September, so it could get really cold, and he's an ultra runner, so you don't really carry a lot of gear. I'm not sure if he had like an emergency blanket or anything like that. And once, if you're at the top of the mountains, you might have cell reception, but when you get below, you don't have cell reception because the mountains are blocking the cell towers. And so, yeah, really tragic story. You know, he probably was hurt or something like that, and the rescue teams are searching a huge area, and they couldn't find him in the 2 weeks that they tried or whatever. So I have a feeling maybe in this summer someone will, but obviously a really tragic situation. So in this case, kind of like with Russell, he probably needed more warm gear and possibly a tent or something like that, but he's an ultra runner. So it's kind of a tough call, but I think in his case, I would at least say, and with anyone really, you should have at least one person with you. If something happens, that other person could at least go and get help, and they're going to know your location. So traveling alone has huge minuses. Your chance of coming out is much, much lower than if there was another person or two with you. And of course, it's not easy to always have a friend or someone with you. So a really important thing to have is a personal locator beacon or a two-way satellite messenger. Some of these you need a subscription, but some of these you don't. And for just $250 to like $350, that could be the difference of being alive or dead. I mean, you can imagine how many people out there could be injured and no one could find them, and you're dying for 2 or 3 days. You could have lived 10, 20, 30, 40 more years if you just spent $200-$300. So get the personal locator beacon or one of these two-way satellite messengers.
So anyway, I hope this information can help you guys. Hopefully it could save some people's lives. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. I've got plenty more videos on this kind of topic in travel, and now I'm doing some like cool true crime stories from Colorado, from like Columbine to Jean-Benet Ramsey and all these other things. So anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Take care and be safe.